Jade Hamilton here with a cub that's not new to my house, but she's certainly new to the channel. This little one is Layla, and I adopted her from eBay a couple of months ago along with her sister Saoirse. Because they were on eBay, they were going for £5 for the pair of them, and nobody wanted them. And I decided that I would take them because I can never bear to see little bears kind of left on their own. It makes me so sad. So Layla came to live with me, didn't you, Puppet? Yeah, you came to live at Mummy's house with all your brothers and sisters, didn't you? Now Layla she's a lovely cream, very fluffy bear. She's got big brown eyes and a little brown nose, and she's wearing a little blue vest, which I think is either George or Florence and Fred, but I can't remember which. Sorry, I had my mouth full, excuse me. But yeah, I think it might be Florence and Fred. This little vest. And the dress she's got on over the top is a wonderful dark blue denim pinafore dress with they're almost like medal ribbons down the pockets in black and red and white. And it's also got a red and white and navy blue trim around the bottom. It's a 0 to 3 month size. The skirt's a bit long on her, but it fits beautifully across. And it's another Junior J, which is Jasper Conrad's brand. I don't know what it is about me and Jasper Conrad dresses, but I seem to be able to find a lot of them for the cubs at the moment. And she's also got on a lovely fleecy sort of toweling backed bandana bib, which is this wonderful sort of duck egg blue green and has rainbows on it with clouds at the ends of them. She looks absolutely gorgeous, don't you, Layla? Or to give her a full name, she's Layla Suzanne. Suzanne with a Z, as in the Leonard Cohen song. While we're also here, we're going to read some more of Buddy, because I know from the comments you guys are really enjoying that. Excuse me, please, while I get it up. As per all videos where I read, all copyright goes to Nigel Hinton and to Penguin. I own absolutely nothing. Make yourself comfortable, grab a hot drink if you've got one, and we'll begin as soon as I've got the story up. Talk amongst yourselves for a sec, guys, while I wrestle with things technological, because is anybody who is a regular viewer to the channel will know me and technology do not get on very well. We tolerate each other, but I don't think we can cohabit very easily. I'm going to have to go back a bit because I've tried to do as my dad used to do when he used to read to me as a child and read ahead slightly to try and make sure that I don't stumble over my words as much. Chapter 14. Buddy tiptoed through to the kitchen and checked that the back door was locked. He wondered whether to open it and slip away over the back gardens. And then what? Besides, it was nerve-wracking at the best of times, dodging from hiding place to hiding place, scared of being seen by someone or of meeting a fierce dog. To do it now, in the dark, would be terrifying, especially if the beast guessed what he was doing and followed. That would be a living nightmare, chased through the dark by the beast. If it was the beast, of course. Who else could it be? The other man. What was his name? Mr. King? No, it had to be the beast. Yet why? And how had he found the address? If only they hadn't taken the phone away. Perhaps he could open the door and yell for help. No, once the door was open, the beast could stop him before anyone heard. He imagined himself being pushed back into the house with the beast's hand clamped across his mouth. The safest thing was to stay locked inside and hope that he would go away. He pulled open the drawer and fumbled round for a knife. He felt the edge of it and cursed. It was almost blunt. Still, better than nothing. He went upstairs quietly. He might get a better view from the bathroom window. He stood on the edge of the bath and eased the little window open. He peered down, screwing his eyes up to concentrate on the patch of gloom. The figure had gone. He looked up and down the road, but as far as he could see, it was empty. He was just stepping off the bath when the bell rang. He started with shock and slipped. The knife fell from his hand and clattered in the bath. He heard its metallic scrape as it slid from one side of the bath to the other, then came to rest in the middle. There was a long silence as he lay on the floor, hardly daring to breathe. The bell rang again. He leapt to his feet, groped for the knife, and started downstairs. The sensible thing would be to go into the kitchen, ready to rush out the back door if the beast tried to come in the front, but he found himself drawn towards the front door. It was as if it would be less scary if he could actually see outside. How strange! Not long ago it had been the beast who'd been inside his house, wondering who was knocking on the door. Perhaps this was just his revenge to show Buddy how frightening it was. Perhaps now he would go away. Buddy slowly lifted the flap of the letterbox until there was a small gap. He could see the collar of a coat and the white skin of a neck. The figure took a step backwards, and the face came into view. He let go of the flap and stood up. His fingers trembled as he clawed at the latch, but at last he turned it and jerked the door open. "Hello, Buddy," his mum said. He didn't know what to do or say. He hadn't seen her for nearly 6 months. Was he still allowed to hug her, like the old days? He thought of shaking hands, but that was ridiculous. He leaned against the door frame and swung the door wider so that she could come in. But she shook her head and glanced down at the road as if she wanted to go. His heart sank. His mum wasn't coming home. She still hated him for stealing. She turned to him, but he looked at the ground and began playing with the catch on the door. "You don't seem very pleased to see me." Her voice was accusing, almost angry. He shrugged and flicked the catch a couple of times to cover the silence. "I'd better go then." "You can come in if you want. You can come in if you want." He tried to make it sound friendly, but it came out as a mumble. "No, I'd better go." Tears began to well up in his eyes, and he pressed his thumb hard against the sharp edge of the catch to hurt himself. "You're all right, are you?" He nodded and clenched his teeth tightly to stop a tear from leaking out of his eye. "Why are you all in the dark?" He turned and looked at the house, pretending he hadn't noticed that the lights were off. "I thought you were someone else," he said, keeping his face turned away. "What?" He repeated it louder. "Oh, you're not in trouble, are you?" He shook his head, and the first tear splashed against his nose as he did so. "Sure?" He nodded and kept staring towards the kitchen until he heard her shoes scrape on the doorstep as she started to walk away. He listened as her footsteps faded away, then closed the door and sat down on the bottom step of the stairs. When he leaned forward, the tears ran down his nose and splattered on his shoes. He rubbed his eyes fiercely with the sleeve of his pullover, glad that the rough texture made his skin sore. It was always the same. Whenever he started crying, he found himself wishing that someone could see him. Like now, he wanted his mum to see him and feel sorry for him. Not even his tears were real. Yet he wanted her back. Well then, wasn't that why he was crying? Partly. But there were other things too. Why hadn't he told her he was sorry? Because he was a phony, that's why. It was the same with his dad. If he really loved him, he wouldn't care about what other people thought about him or the clothes he wore. He was crying because he hated himself. He was crying because he was scared and because he felt sorry for himself and because all those feelings jumbled around inside him until he didn't know what was what. How could he love his dad and be ashamed of him at the same time? How could he love his mum and hate her for leaving? Or want to be part of 3E and yet despise it. If he really thought stealing was wrong, why did he do it? Why couldn't he be simple instead of having all these opposite things in him? He stood up and went to the kitchen, bumping against the wall. He ran the cold water and splashed it on his face. He was drying himself on the towel when the bell rang. This time it probably was the beast, but he didn't care. He opened the door. It was his mum again. Buddy, I don't want to stay here in case your dad comes back. Come for a walk, will you? Please? 1 second. Let me just... If you've got parcels, just leave them outside, lovey. Thanks, love. Have a lovely rest of your day. Oh, crikey. Sorry, folks. That was the post person delivering some parcels. Now, where were we? Sorry, I thought I'd paused you, but I hadn't. My apologies. He opened the door. It was his mum again. Buddy, I don't want to stay here in case your dad comes back. Come for a walk, will you? Please? They walked quickly, without talking, until they were well away from his road. Then his mum slowed down. She asked if he knew where there was a cafe open, and at least that gave them something to talk about. In the end, the nearest place they could think of was the snack bar at the bus station. Buddy sat at a table in the corner while she went up to the counter. She came back with a Coke and a donut for him and a cup of tea for herself. You've cut your hair, he said. She smiled and patted the short strands that barely covered her ears. Do you like it? He nodded, but it wasn't true. He preferred it when it came down. It used to come down to her shoulders. One of the pictures he'd had in his mind all this time was the way she had always had to sweep it away from her face when she bent down to do something. Other things were changed too. She was thinner, and she wasn't wearing any makeup. He took a bite of the donut, but it was stale. His mouth was dry, and it took ages to chew it. Would she be angry if he left it? Suddenly he wished he hadn't come. He felt awkward and nervous. He took a sip of his drink to help him swallow the cake. You haven't half grown, she said. Have I? Nearly taller than me. He picked up the salt cellar, poured some salt on the shiny black surface of the table, and began making patterns in it with his finger. This was terrible. If he didn't say it now, he'd never be able to. They'd go on saying silly things, and it would be too late. He pushed the salt into a pile, then put his finger in the middle and moved it round to make a big O. Without looking up, he said it. I'm sorry. What? I'm sorry. His finger trembled and broke the circle of salt. About the money. What money? He looked up. She didn't know what he was talking about. There was a puzzled frown on her face. I thought, what, my love? Tell me. She didn't hate him. He could see it in her eyes. And she called him her love. I thought you went away because I stole the money from your purse. She put her hand to her mouth and closed her eyes. She stayed like that, shaking her head, until he began to be worried. He looked round. Nobody was watching. He reached across and touched her other hand. Her fingers gripped him tight. Buddy, it's not true. You mustn't ever think it. Promise me. Never think it. Never say it. It's not true. Promise me. I promise. She let go of his hand and glanced round the cafe, then edged her chair nearer the table. I had to get away, Buddy. Not because of you. Not even just because of your dad. For me, I suppose. It's hard to explain. I still love you, though. Both of you. Buddy suddenly remembered his dad hiding the photo. They still loved each other. It had all been a mistake. Everything will be all right again. Will you come home? He asked. I can't. Not just like that. Why? She shook her head and twisted her cup round and round in the saucer. I can't, that's all. Do you love someone else? No, it's not that. Oh, Buddy, can you understand? I want to come home, but at the same time I don't. She stopped, as if she was sure he couldn't make any sense of what she was saying. But he could. It was something he knew only too well. Loads of times I nearly came back. Last Sunday I went round to the house. I saw you with your dad, and all I wanted to do was come in and see you both, talk to you, but I knew it wouldn't be any good. It would all be the same like before, and I can't go through all that again. I'm selfish, that's what it is. I want you, but changed, different. Not you, your dad, our life, not all the rows again. We got married too young, had you too young. I missed out on everything. I'm not a very good mum. You are, Mum. Don't say that. You are. He'd blurted it out too loud, and he could see by the way his mum's eyes flicked round the room that people must be listening. He fought back the tears. He would not cry. He would not. Here, I'm going to school now. Well, not school. Evening classes. Business studies. 3 evenings a week. Can you imagine me scribbling away at a desk? We learn all about computers and things. I'm a right dunce. She laughed. I bet you're not. If I pass the exams, I'm going to get a better job. Same company, but more responsibility. Better money. She lowered her voice again. Is your dad working? Buddy shook his head. You mustn't tell her about that. He might get a job driving taxis. They need drivers. His mum's mouth tried to smile, but couldn't. Let's go, she said, standing up. He waited at the door while she went to the counter and paid. They walked back slowly, and she told him about the flat she shared with a lady in her office. He only half listened because he was going over and over in his mind what he wanted to say. "I've written the address," she said, stopping and fumbling with her handbag. She handed him a piece of paper. "If you want, you can come round and see me any time. Buddy, you mustn't hate me for what I've done." "I don't. Love you." She bit her lip and fumbled with her bag again. "Look, I won't come any further. Here's some money. No, please take it. Buddy, please." He took the money and bundled it into his pocket with her address. Now. He had to say it now, before she went. It all burst out of it. It burst out of him, all in the wrong order. "Dad loves you. He's going to save up and buy a shop again. He's going to get a job. He looks at your photo. Honest, I know he loves you. He wants you to come home. So do I." His voice was trembling and the breath was bursting his lungs. "I can't. Not yet. I'll think about it, I promise." She walked away a couple of steps, then stopped. "Come and see me. Don't say anything to your dad. Just give me time. Buddy?" He nodded and she went, turning once to wave before she disappeared round the corner. He walked slowly, but speeded up as the thought struck him. She only wanted a bit of time to think. He started to trot. She was going to think it over. And if he could prove that his dad had changed, she'd come back. That was obvious. She still loved them. He was running now, the wind making his eyes water and his throat raw with the cold. Somehow or other, he'd make his dad get a proper job, driving a taxi, anything. And when his mum saw how things had changed, she would come back. She would. Chapter 15. The whole thing didn't seem so easy the next morning. For a start, his dad talked of nothing else but a Harley Davidson. He'd arranged to pick it up at 2 in the afternoon, and, as promised, he was going to buy a helmet for Buddy. He talked so excitedly about it that Buddy didn't have the heart to bring up a subject for a job. It would only cause a row. When they got to the bike shop, the Harley Davidson was outside, polished and all ready to go. His dad ran a hand over the handlebars before they went in. They were met by the man who'd taken it away on the truck. This time, though, he was all smiles and friendly chat as the papers were signed and the money was handed over. "We looked after it nicely for you. I knew it would. We looked after it nicely for you. I knew it would only be temporary like. We all run short sometimes." He beamed. "See what a bit of money does?" his dad said when they hurried off to get a selection of helmets to show them. Buddy had been thinking the same thing, and he knew it would make his task even harder. His dad would hardly want to work as a taxi driver, and he had so much money already. The shopkeeper tried to persuade him to buy a really expensive helmet, but Buddy deliberately chose the cheapest. It wasn't very comfortable and it looked awful, but at least it would mean there was a bit more to go towards the record shop. Though more and more he was beginning to think that the shop was just a wild dream. They drove fast through the town, and even faster when they got to the dual carriageway along the coast. Normally Buddy would have found it exciting, but he wasn't in the mood. "Slow down!" he shouted as they weaved in and out of the traffic too fast. Cars hooted at them, but his dad just laughed and accelerated so that all Buddy could do was move closer to his back and hang on tight. They stayed on the main road for about 20 minutes, and they then turned onto a side road that twisted and climbed towards the cliffs. The tyres screamed as they skidded and slid across the corners overlooking the steep drop to the sea. When they reached the highest point, his dad twisted the handlebars and they bounced off the road onto the grass of the cliff top. For one terrible instant, Buddy thought they were going over the edge, but at the last moment they swerved away and stopped. Buddy stumbled off, shaking with fright and cold, his hands numb from the wind. "You're mad! We could have had a crash." Chick, 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 chicken. His dad cheeked. "I don't care. You're stupid." "Nah, it's great. Got to take a few risks." "Yeah, it's all right for you." Buddy's anger blazed, and he lashed out at his dad's arm. "Here, do that again, and I'll knock your block off." Buddy avoided the blow that his dad aimed at his shoulder and ran across the grass towards the road. He turned left and headed back the way they'd come. It was all downhill and he ran fast, his weight carrying almost too quickly for his legs, the shock of each step rattling his teeth. Halfway down there was a roar and the bike shot past. It rounded a corner and the noise of the engine faded away. He slowed to a walk and felt in his pocket for the money his mum had given him. At least he could catch a bus home, if there were any buses. Better than going back on the bike. His dad was mad and reckless. No wonder his mum had walked out on him. He was crazy and selfish. He just didn't care about how anyone else felt. Let him drive fast and kill himself. Let him get in trouble with the police. It would serve him right. When he reached the bottom of the hill, he rounded the final bend and found his dad sitting at the side of the road next to the bike. Buddy was going to walk right past, but his dad stood up and grinned shyly. "Okay, I'm stupid. I'm sorry." He knocked with his knuckles at the top of Buddy's helmet. "My nut's as thick as that. Come on, don't be angry." Then he pulled such a silly face that Buddy couldn't help laughing. His dad drove slowly and carefully along the narrow road that ran near the sea. They stopped and walked on the beach for a while, and then went to a small cafe for a drink. There was a pinball table, and his dad challenged him to a game. Buddy won the first game, but his dad said it was only because he couldn't play properly without music. "That's better," he said as he fed some coins into the jukebox and the music boomed out. "Now I'll show you who's king." His dad won 5 games in a row, and Buddy had to admit he was good. "Course I'm good. I had the training, didn't I? All them years down Rube's calf when I should have been in school. Mind you, I'd rather be a genius like you, and I ain't kidding neither." It was dark when they got back into town. His dad dropped him at home and said he'd probably be late back. Dad wanted to say something about the rotten hours his dad worked, and then try and lead on to the whole thing about the job, but the bike roared away before he could bring himself to start talking. The time passed incredibly slowly. Buddy was bored and lonely. He tried reading, but he couldn't settle to it. His mind was buzzing. If only his dad would start the record shop again, he could tell his mum that everything was all right. At 9 o'clock, he decided to walk into the centre of town. He would have liked to go and visit his mum. She'd said come any time, but there was nothing good to tell her yet. There was a road map outside the town hall. At least he could go and find out where the road was. He took the piece of paper from his back pocket and looked at the address. 23B Raynal Avenue. It was drizzling slightly when he reached the town hall, and he had to wipe the glass to see the map. There was a key to the roads at the bottom. Raynal Avenue was in square E5. The street lights reflected on the glass and made it hard to see, but in the end he found it. He traced the shortest way to get there from his house and thought about how one day he would make that journey with his dad to pick up his mum's things and bring her home. He wondered about whether to go round there now, just to see the house, but the drizzle was turning to rain, and his sweater was already damp. As he started for home, there was the far-off sound of a siren. It grew louder and louder until a police car came racing towards him with his blue lights flashing. Instinctively, Buddy stepped back into a shop doorway until it passed, then began to run through the rain, which was now pelting down. The drops stung his face and trickled down his neck. The rain eased as he turned into his road, and it stopped completely just as he reached the front door. But he was already soaked. He ran a hot bath and lay in it, feeling it drive the cold from his body and relaxed him. By the time he dried himself, he could barely keep his eyes open. It was 10:30. His dad might be home soon. He got into bed and tried to read to keep awake, but it was no good. He switched off the light and closed his eyes. "Buddy!" His dad was calling him, and it was part of his dream, but it was real too. Perhaps it was already morning. He opened his eyes and it was dark. "Buddy?" The voice was muffled. Or rather, "Buddy?" The voice was muffled. Where was he? Not in the room. Not in the corridor. He got out of bed and stumbled to the door. He switched on the corridor light and squinted at the sudden brightness. He pushed open the door to his bedroom, but the bed was empty. "Dad? In here!" His voice was coming from the bathroom. Buddy went to push the door and then saw the blood. It had splashed round the door handle and run in long lines down the white paint. "Buddy, don't come in. Stay there. Now listen, I'm bleeding, right? Dad! Now don't panic. My hands are all cut, but it's nothing, just blood. But I need you to help me, see? There's some towels in the airing cupboard. I need 'em." Buddy ran and got a pile of towels from the cupboard. His hands were trembling and he was starting to feel weak. There were drops of blood all the way up the stairs and along the corridor. "I've got them." "Okay, now listen. Don't you be silly, Buddy." "I won't." The door handle was slippery with blood, and Buddy's knees wobbled as he opened the door. His dad was sitting on the edge of the bath. Buddy saw a pool of blood on the lino, then jerked his eyes away. He would concentrate on his dad's face. It was pale and damp, and there was a glazed look in his eyes. "Dad, what happened?" "I thought I could do it on my own, but I can't. I've got to wash my hands. There's a little bottle of disinfectant in that cabinet." Pour some in the sink, then fill it up with water and rinse it round. It's got to be clean. Right. Now put the plug back in and fill the sink with water. Good. Now pour a lot of disinfectant in. More? That'll do. Buddy did as he was told, following each instruction, quickly but calmly. He watched the water go cloudy as the disinfectant mixed with it. So far it had been easy. The hard part was coming. You have to help me off with my jacket and my shirt. His dad stood up and swayed slightly. Buddy could hear the blood dripping onto the lino, but he didn't look down. He worked fast, unzipping the leather jacket and easing it off his dad's shoulders and down his arms. He saw a blur of red as the hand slipped out at the end of the sleeves. He slung the jacket over the rim of the bath and started undoing the front of his dad's shirt. Now for the buttons on the sleeves. The cuffs were soaked with blood. But he gritted his teeth and undid the buttons quickly. Good lad, his dad said as Buddy pulled the shirt off. Now just hold on to me, will you? I'm going to put my hands in the water and it's going to hurt like mad. I don't want to go fooling and banging me nut on the bath. But he stood behind him and put his hands on his shoulders. There was a moment's hesitation, then his dad leaned forward and put his hands into the water. He gasped and moaned. His whole body went rigid with the pain. But he gripped the shoulders and felt the muscles tight and knotted with the effort. Gradually the muscles released and his dad sighed. Blimey, it's enough, Stig. Okay, you can let go now. Shall I call the doctor or something? No. Maybe you need stitches. Maybe you need stitches. No. What happened? I came off the bike, didn't I? But he knew it was a lie. And he knew why his dad didn't want to see a doctor. He was in trouble. Dad, please. Stop fussing and get some towels. I want you to tie 'em round my hands. But he picked up a towel and held it ready. His dad pulled one hand out of the red water and Buddy wrapped the towel round it quickly. That's it. Tie it tight. Tighter. Buddy round the towel as tight as he could, then got another one and wrapped it round once and tied it. His dad lifted his other hand out of the water, and this time Buddy caught sight of the deep cuts that crisscrossed the fingers and palm and stretched right up to the wrist. He drew back for a second, then forced himself to wind the towel round. He got another towel and tied it round the wrist the first one hadn't covered. His dad was shaking by the time he'd finished, and his face was very pale. He put an arm round Buddy's shoulder, and they walked slowly to his bedroom. He sat on the bed, and Buddy bent down and took off his shoes. That's better, his dad said as he lay down. Buddy covered him with the sleeping bag, tucking it up to his chin, but leaving his arms outside. The blood was already beginning to seep through the towels, so Buddy got a couple more and laid them under his dad's hands. That'll do. That'll do. I'm okay. Listen, slip your jeans on and bring the Arlie round the back. Put it in the garden. I don't want no one to see it. And Buddy, if anybody asks, I was here all evening, right? He dashed to his room, got his jeans on, and ran outside. The Harley was lying on the pavement. He glanced up and down the empty street then picked it up and wheeled it into the back garden. Back in the house, he got another towel and started to clean up the mess in the bathroom. He'd just finished wiping when he noticed a briefcase behind the door. He flicked the catch, but it was locked. He shook it and there was a dull rattle. "Buddy!" He dropped the case in shock and saw his dad in the doorway. "What is it?" "Nothing." He felt his temper rise. "Okay, then I'll put it in the dustbin." His dad sighed helplessly. "Okay, it's jewellery, and it don't need you knocking it about. Where'd you get it?" "From a man. You stole it, didn't you?" "No, I did not. I told you, I'm buying and selling antiques." "Then how did you cut yourself?" "I fell off me bike." "Like hell you did." His dad's eyes blazed. "Shut up and go to bed. Go on." But he knew there was no point in talking. Besides, his dad was weak and beginning to sway again. He walked out of the bathroom and into his room, took off his jeans and got into bed. A couple of minutes later the hall light went off and he heard his dad groan as he lay down on the bed. Well, he'd finally got the proof, as if he needed it. His dad was stealing. Even if he got away with it this time, it wouldn't be long before he was caught. That would be the end of everything. His mum would never come home. And what would happen to him if his dad went to prison? He buried his face in the pillow so his dad wouldn't hear him crying. He hated him. Chapter 16. His dad got up early, but he heard him go downstairs and into the kitchen. There was the sound of running water and the clatter of something, and the excuse me. But he got up early. No, sorry. Chapter 6. His dad got up early, but he heard him go downstairs and into the kitchen. There was the sound of running water, then a clatter as something, probably the kettle, fell in the sink. He must be trying to make a cup of tea. A couple of minutes later there was another crash, and his dad swore. He'd broken a cup from the sound. Buddy could picture the struggle as his dad tried to make tea with his hands still wrapped in the towels. He hoped his dad would cool, so he'd have the pleasure of pretending that he was still asleep. Let him struggle. Let him hurt his hands and make them bleed. He was a liar and a thief, and he was ruining everything. All he cared about was his stupid bike. A proper dad wouldn't raise money on things like that. A proper dad would have done everything he could to get an honest job and save his money and try to make his mum come home. But he lay there, letting his resentment build up. But gradually the silence began to worry him. Suppose he fainted. Suppose he'd fainted. The silence went on, and finally he had to get up to go and see what had happened. His dad was sitting at the kitchen table. His face seemed even whiter in the daylight, and there were dark rings round his eyes. He'd roughly wrapped some new towels round his hands, and only a bit of blood had soaked through them. There was a broken cup on the floor, and tea leaves all over the draining board. Neither of them spoke as Buddy boiled the kettle and made the tea. He poured a cup of tea for each of them and sat down. His dad tried twice to lift the cup with his two fists, but the tea slopped over the towels and he had to put it down again. Blooming baby, his dad mumbled, then grinned and said, "You'll have to change me nappy next." But he didn't laugh. It wasn't the time for jokes. "You've got to stop it, Dad." "Stop what?" "You know what. Stealing." "I told you. I don't care what you told me. I know." "You don't know nothing. Anything. Anything. You can't even talk properly." His dad got up, knocking his chair flying, and stomped out of the room. "You don't care about me," Buddy yelled as he went. "You'll get in trouble and go to prison, and then what? Then you won't have to put up with me." His dad shouted back and went to the front room, kicking the door to behind him. Buddy went upstairs and took his school things out of his bag. The things his dad's money had paid for, just as he'd paid for his trousers. So what? That's what dads were supposed to do. Pay for things you had to have. Why should he feel grateful for that? Anyway, they were like stolen goods. He could probably be in trouble for accepting them. That was nothing to thank his dad for. He opened his books and tried to do his homework, but it was no good. He should never have lost his temper over a word his dad said wrong. That was just a waste of time when there were such important things to think about. And now, when his dad needed him to help, was the best time to do it instead of sulking up here. His dad was sitting on the sofa with his hands on his knees. He'd unwrapped the towels and laid them on his lap to stop the blood running onto his trousers. The cuts on the fingers and wrists stopped bleeding, but the gashes on his palms still oozed steadily. "You ought to go to hospital." But he said, "I don't need none of your advice," his dad said, flapping the ends of the towels over to hide his hands. Buddy went to the window and stared out. "What for?" Stared out. "I want you to ring someone. I want you to ring someone." "What for?" Buddy asked without turning round. "None of your business." "I won't do it then." "I thought you didn't want to get me to get into trouble." "I don't." "Well then, I can't do it myself, can I? I want someone to come over and get that bag, if you must know. It's too dangerous to keep it here." "Why?" "It's because it's stolen, isn't it?" "Yes, all right, it's stolen. Now are you satisfied?" It was pointless crying, but he couldn't help it. He slid down the wall onto the floor and the sobs shook his whole body. His dad came over and crouched down next to him, his hands bleeding. "Don't do that, Buddy. Come on, stop crying." But he couldn't. He pulled his knees up to his face and shuddered with the misery that poured out of him. He thought it would never stop, but eventually he cried himself out until only the occasional sob shook him. "Crying don't help," his dad said. "Just makes it worse." "Can't be worse," Buddy said, and he started to hiccup. "You're joking. Being caught's worse." "Don't do it then." "It ain't that easy once you start." "Course it is. I stopped nicking from shops." "From shops?" His dad looked shocked, and Buddy almost laughed, but a hiccup came instead. I stopped. I hope you did. And his dad realised. He shook his head and laughed. I'm a fine one to talk. Blimey, what a pair. I stopped. You can. You don't understand. I'm in too deep. It's not like nicking from shops. It's not like nicking from shops. His dad got up and went back to the sofa. He dabbed his hands on the towels, then lay back with a sigh, staring at the ceiling. But he wiped his face and shifted his weight. His legs were numb and he was cold, but strangely he felt happier. At least his dad was telling the truth now, and it was good to have been able to say about the shoplifting. I'll ring if you like, he said. His dad continued to stare at the ceiling, and Buddy could see his Adam's apple moving up and down as if he had to keep on swallowing. Ta, his dad said at last. What's the number? 30065. Ask for a bloke called King. Tell him something went wrong and I want to see him at my place. Say it's urgent. Buddy memorised the number and got up and went to the door. Buddy? What? I'll try, all right? He was so excited about what his dad had said. It wasn't until he was dialing the number that he realised King, Mr. King. That was the name the beast had said. It was all beginning to come together. The pips went, and he pushed the coin into the slot. The pips, by the way, are the beeping noise that you used to get in old-fashioned telephone boxes, telling you to put the coins in to make a call, or telling you you'd run out of money. They're also the beep, beep, beeps you hear just before the news if you listen to Radio 4. Fun fact. Hello, said a voice. Can I speak to Mr. King, please? Speaking. Buddy gave the message. The man hesitated for a bit and sounded angry, but he said he'd be over as soon as he could. When he got home, his dad asked him to go to the Indian grocer's on the corner of Priory Street to see if they sold bandages. The lady there spent ages searching through the crowded shelves. She kept saying, I know we have them. I'm sure we have them. And at the end she found them and he bought 6 packets. Ace! His dad said when Buddy finished wrapping the bandages round. He'd done them really tight to try to press some of the big cuts together. His dad ought to have them stitched, but there was no point in saying anything. Buddy spent the rest of the morning selecting records and playing them for his dad, who lay on the sofa with his arms above his head to try and stop the bleeding. But just after 1 o'clock, the bell rang and Buddy went to the door. There was no doubt that Mr. King was the man who'd taken the Ribeiro taxi from outside number 56. He fitted Julius's description perfectly. His white hair was quite long, and his fringe touched the top of his thick glasses. The lenses magnified his eyes, so they looked too big for his face, and he reeked of cigars. Terry's boy, he said, and patted Buddy on the cheek. What's your name? Tubby, isn't it? Buddy, that's right. Your dad in? Buddy showed him to the front room. where his dad was standing up, looking rather anxious. His hands were thrust deep into the pockets of his trousers. "Hello, Des. Thanks for coming and that. Turn the music off, buddy. Just been talking to him," Mr. King said, patting Buddy's cheek again as he walked by to the record player. "What you done to his hair?" "Ain't me," his dad said. "They all got it round here. Skinheads or something. Horrible, innit? He's tall too. Looks a right villain. How old is he?" 12. I'm 14 next week, Buddy said. "And I'm not a skinhead." 14, Mr. King said, sitting down in a chair without being asked. "He shouldn't be that tall, should he? Not a 14. Anyway, has he got something to do? Something to do? Oh, yeah, homework. He's a right brain box at school. You better get on with it then. Eh, Buddy?" Upstairs, Buddy left the room and pulled the door to, deliberately not closing it fully. He stomped on the stairs on the way up, then took off his shoes and tiptoed down again. He stood close to the door, ready to dash along into the kitchen if necessary. Mr. King was talking, and his voice had lost all of its friendliness. It was hard and cold. "I don't care what happened. I set up a safe house and it's your job to get it there. I take enough risks without having to worry about your end of things. You could have sent it round with that kid of yours." "No, I'm not pleased. I'm not pleased, Terry. Don't let it happen again." There was a pause. Then his dad said quietly, "I was thinking maybe I ought to lay off for a bit. A few days until your hands are better. But I've got a couple of jobs marked out for the weekend that have got to be done." I don't know, Des. Don't know what. I think I've had enough. Now look, Terry, I did you a favour letting you in on this. I know, but you owe me, so don't forget it. This isn't any of your small time operations, you know. This is export stuff. I've got things running nice. Customers in Europe and the States, and they expect delivery. So don't you start making my life hard. Des, don't Des me. I'm committed, and so are you. You can have a few days off for your hands, but I want you around Croxley Street at 8 Friday evening. Understood? Good. Buddy tiptoed back up the stairs to his room. He was shaking with anger. Mr. King had treated his dad like a little kid. His voice had been like Mr. Normington's when he told someone off. And his dad had just taken it too. Hardly said a thing. Why hadn't he hit him or kicked him out? So now it would go on as before. His dad would take more risks and eventually he would get caught. All because of that Mr. King. About 5 minutes later, his dad called him and Buddy went downstairs. His dad looked miserable, but Mr. King was smiling, as if they'd only been having a friendly chat. "Here he is," Mr. King said. What they call you at school? What they call you at school? Oh, here he is," Mr. King said. What they call you at school? Beanpole. Buddy glared at him. I want a bag of some sort, big enough to hold this, Mr. King said, holding up the briefcase. Buddy was furious at being ordered around by him, but at least it meant that he was taking the jewellery away. He found a large plastic bag in the kitchen and gave it to Mr. King, who slipped the briefcase inside. Perfect. Well, I'll have to love and leave you. Don't forget Friday. No, stay there, Terry, and rest yourself. Young Longshanks here can see me out. Buddy opened the front door. Mr. King stepped out and began to turn as if to say goodbye, but Buddy closed the door long before he could speak. He went into the kitchen and heated up some soup and made some toast. He didn't feel at all hungry, but they ought to eat. He crumbled the toast into his dad's soup to make it easier, but his dad still had trouble with the spoon. He'd eaten less than half of it when he threw down the spoon and went upstairs to bed. Not a word had been spoken. Buddy sat in the front room brooding over all the terrible things that were likely to happen. The afternoon thickened towards dusk, and the room grew gloomier. He decided to match his mood by making it even darker. He drew the curtains, and then, as he was sitting down again, the idea came to him. It was so shocking he tried to push it out of his mind, but it wouldn't go. It stayed there and grew until it seemed the only solution. He tried to tell himself it was wrong, but the more he thought about the facts, the less wrong it seemed. Before he knew what was happening, he'd accepted the plan and was beginning to work out the details. One after the other, the pieces fell into place until one doubt remained in his mind. He went up to his dad's room. "Are you asleep, Dad?" "No. I got worried." "What about?" "Supposing the police caught Mr. King with that bag." "Don't worry about him. He's too sharp." "But supposing they did, would he split on you?" "Don't be daft. He's plenty of things, but he ain't a grass." "Oh, you all right?" "Yeah, I'll stay here and try and kip a bit." But he closed the door and went downstairs. That was it then. The last problem had been solved. The plan was complete. Chapter 17. When Buddy got home from school the next day, he helped his dad change his bandages. The bleeding had finally stopped, and now it was possible to see how deep some of the cuts were. Buddy's head started to swim at one stage, but he thought he saw the whites of bone. He thought he saw the whites of bone at the bottom of a long cut on the finger. His dad swore a couple of times with the pain, but he kept telling Buddy to tie the bandages tightly. When it was finished, he tried wiggling his fingers, but a couple of them still weren't moving properly, and he sat rubbing them gently. There was a worried expression on his face, and Buddy felt guilty about leaving him alone, but it had to be done. "I've got to go out, Dad." "Oh, where?" "Down the satellite. We're painting it up, and I said I'd help. Just for a few hours. I did my homework at school." The lies were all prepared, and they slipped out easily and convincingly. "Don't know how long I'll be. Do you want anything? Nah, I'll be all right. Oh, yeah, you can make us a cup of tea. Buddy cursed silently. It was already nearly 5 o'clock. He went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. It would take over 20 minutes to get to his mum's office. He mustn't miss her. The kettle seemed to take ages to boil, and when it did, he was so anxious to pour it quickly that some drops splashed round the rim of the teapot and burned his fingers. Right, see you, he said when he took the tea in. You ain't going like that, are you? You'll get paint on your trousers. Oh, yeah, I forgot. He went upstairs and changed quickly, leaving his school clothes dumped in a pile by his bed. Bye, he shouted, dashing down and out the front door before there were any more delays. He ran all the way, and it was just 5:30 by the time he got to the office. He stood on the other side of the main road and watched the people coming out. The flow of people was so steady that the automatic doors never had time to close. He was worried in case his mum came out in a large group and he missed her. At last, she came out the doors, talking to two women. They stood on the pavement, smiling and chatting. His mum said something, and one of the women laughed and touched his mum's arm. But he felt a strange swell in his heart. That was his mum. She had friends who laughed with her and liked her. She looked so smart, and it was true. Her short hair really did suit her. The three of them talked for a moment longer. Then the other two said goodbye and walked away. His mum turned in the other direction. Buddy watched her go, then followed, keeping to his side of the road. It gave him a thrill that she didn't know he was there, as if he was seeing something secret and hidden that brought him closer to her. No one else in the world was watching her stop at that shop and look in the window. Not even his dad or her friends from the office could see her change her bag from her left to her right shoulder, then quickly pat the back of her hair, and everything was being done naturally, for herself alone, because she didn't know anyone was there. For 10 minutes he followed, watching every move, the way her skirt swayed when she walked, how the collar of her jacket brushed the jagged line of her hair, how she rocked back on her heels while she was waiting to how she rocked back on her heels while she was waiting to cross roads. He wished he could be invisible and watch her for days, at work, at her new home. He wanted to be inside her head, to know what she thought. How often did she think of him? Perhaps she was thinking of him now, as she waited at the traffic lights for a break in the stream of cars. When she turned left down a quiet side road, he ran after her. She heard his footsteps and turned. There was a look of shock. Then she smiled. He wanted to hug her, but he held himself back. Buddy! Fancy seeing you! I was coming round to see you. You said come round. They looked at each other, and Buddy suddenly felt awkward and clumsy. While he'd been following her, it all seemed so easy to say to her. But here, face to face, he didn't know. He didn't know what to say. Come on then, she said, and they started walking. How's school? Okay. He wanted to say something else, anything that would keep them talking, but he couldn't think of a single thing. The one thing that he wanted to say, the question he had to ask, burned in his head, but he couldn't just come out with it. He became aware of the sound of her footsteps. Then twice he nearly asked her a question about work, but the words wouldn't come out. He stepped on the uneven bit of pavement and their shoulders bumped as he moved further away from her. His jeans made a scraping sound as the legs brushed. He tried to stop it by keeping his legs further apart, but he thought it must look strange, so he went back to walking normally. Here we are, she said. We're in the basement. But he didn't even look at the house. He wanted to run away, but he forced himself to follow her down the steps. I can never get this door open first time, she said, fumbling with the key. Buddy gave a sort of laugh, then wished he hadn't. The next half hour seemed endless. He said the flat was nice and, yes, please, he would like a cup of tea, but then he sat there in silence while his mum got it ready. He'd just been on the point of forcing himself to say why he'd come when the woman who shared the flat arrived home from work. This is Joyce, his mum said. He got up quickly and knocked the table so hard with his legs that the bottle of milk fell over. Milk ran everywhere and dripped onto the floor. The two women mopped it up while he stood embarrassed in the corner. They all sat at the table and drank their tea. His mum and Joyce started talking about work. They went on about some man who wouldn't let Joyce make important decisions. Twice Joyce said she hoped that Buddy wouldn't grow up thinking that men were better than women. He shook his head and tried to look interested, but he wished she would go away so he could be alone with his mum. At last, Joyce stood up and left, saying she had things to do in her room. What do you think of her? Her mum asked. Isn't she great? Buddy nodded. She's been fantastic to me, letting me share this place and everything. We just talk the whole time about everything. Politics, books, things I never used to talk about. She's like a sister. You know what I mean? Buddy nodded, but felt sad and empty, as though Joyce was some sort of rival for his mum's love. He and his dad never talked about books and politics. How could they hope to win her back when she was so happy here? I like books, he said. His mum lit a cigarette. I'm trying to cut down, she said, holding the cigarette up straight and looking at it. I hope you haven't started. He shook his head. Well, don't. I suppose your dad's still smoking those old roll-your-owns. I always think about him whenever I smell that smoke somewhere. She smiled and did an imitation of the way his dad flicked a cigarette from one side of his mouth to the other. Buddy laughed, then seized the opportunity. Will you come and see him on Friday? Buddy, I can't. Why not? Are you doing something? No. Well, I just can't. It's not that easy. I don't know what I feel. I don't know what he feels. He loves you. I know. You can't be sure. I'm the one that left. He might not want me after that. Anyway, I don't know if I want all that again. She got up and walked over to the sink. She flicked some ash into it and suddenly turned on the tap and held the cigarette under the water before throwing it into the rubbish bin. "You said you missed us." But he said, "I do. But it might be different when I'm back there. Supposing it doesn't work out. I don't want to do all this to you again. I'm bad enough, Mum, as it is." "You keep saying that, and it's not true." "Oh, buddy. It doesn't mean you have to come back yet. Just talk. Please?" He could feel that she was nearly ready to say yes, and he was suddenly scared. Supposing she was right. Supposing it was too soon for them to meet. It might ruin any chance they would get together again. It would have been much better if he'd had more time to arrange things, talk to his dad and get him in the right mood, but he didn't have the time. He had to make sure that his dad didn't leave the house on Friday. And this was the only way he could manage it, the only way he could think of doing it. And it wouldn't go wrong, mustn't go wrong. "Please, Mum, just talk, that's all. You'll see, everything's better now." She was still at the sink, looking out of the window at the brick wall below the garden. He got up and stood behind her. He could smell her perfume, and he wanted to pull her cloak so she'd know how much he loved her. "Go on, Mum. You'll be at home this Friday if you come at 7:30. She breathed deeply, then nodded. "All right, but no promises about anything. Understand?" Yes. Now the decision had been made. They could they both seemed to relax, and it was easy to talk and laugh. She took a photo from her bag and showed it to him. It was one of him when he was 18 months, standing next to her on a beach. They fell about laughing at how fat he looked and how young she looked in a tiny miniskirt with her hair piled up on top of her head and her eyes plastered with mascara. "I wasn't half mad when I was carrying you," she said. "Well, 'cause I was too big to wear my minis." "Don't laugh. I love my minis." He talked about school and she told him about her evening classes. She got really excited when she spoke about the things she was learning, and he loved to see the happiness on her face. It was a whole new side to her. He would have liked to stay longer, but he didn't want to be too late in case his dad became suspicious about where he'd been. He reminded her that she had to be there by 7:30 on Friday, and she promised that she wouldn't be late. As they stood at the front door, he realised how much he'd grown. She had to turn her face up slightly to look at him now. She ran her hand over his hair and gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, then went back inside. During the walk home, he told himself that it had gone well. The most difficult part was over. Now all he had to do was arrange the other half of the plan with Charmian. Seeing Charmian turned out to be harder than he'd expected. He'd forgotten that she did judo on Tuesdays at lunchtime, and during the other breaks she was always talking to someone else. Finally, He had to write her a note during the last lesson, asking her to meet him in the library after school. He underlined "alone", folded the note, and threw it across the aisle to her, while the teacher's back was turned. Julius saw him do it and gave him a questioning look, but Buddy ignored him. At the end of the lesson, he went straight to the library. There were a few kids there choosing books, but no one from 3E. He sat at a table and waited. But after 10 minutes, he began to wonder if something had gone wrong. So he went to the door. She was coming along the corridor, and he ran to her. Sorry, Jules was being awkward. He wanted to come. Did you tell him anything? Only that I was seeing you. What's it all about, anyway? Buddy had thought about only telling her part of the plan and lying about why he was doing it, but in the end, he decided he must tell her the whole truth. He waited until they were out in the deserted playground, and then began. It was hard at first, saying things he tried to keep secret, but soon it was pouring out. They stood in the empty bike shed, and Charmian listened without interrupting as he described how he discovered what his dad was doing. When he went over his plan, step by step, telling her what he wanted her to do. In the silence after he'd finished, he'd realized that sometime while he'd been talking, it had started to rain. It was beating on the corrugated iron roof of the shed, and the cold wind was blowing some drops in on them. They moved further in and leaned against the back wall. I'm scared, Charmian said. Why? The police and everything. I don't like it. He'll go to jail, Buddy, because of us. Well, he's a thief, isn't he? My dad wants to stop Shah. My dad wants to stop Shah, and he won't let him. What about Mrs. Solomon? He's the one who's making her scared. He felt bad about using Mrs. Solomon in the argument because he didn't care anything about her. On the other hand, he was desperate. Without Charmian's help, he'd never be able to do it. He went on and on about how terrible Mr. King was and how he was ruining so many people's lives, and perhaps hinted that perhaps he was the one who'd killed Mrs. Solomon's cat. You wait, she'll be really pleased, he said. What do I tell her? But his heart skipped a beat. It was the first sign that she might do it. Just say we found out that there's something going on in 56 and we've got proof. Then ask her if she'll ring the cops. Blimey, Buddy, I don't know. What do we tell them? Just that you've seen someone break into the house, that's all. I'd do it myself, but they might think I'm a kid playing a joke. Please, Shah, please. Mrs. Solomon's the only one who could do it. You don't have to give the number or anything. Just make sure they send someone round. Charmian walked away and stood at the end of the shed, staring out at the edge of the shed, staring out at the rain. Suddenly she stepped out onto the wet playground. She turned. Buddy ran after her, calling, Shah! She stopped and turned round to him. Drops of rain were caught in the wiry tangle of her hair, and the splashes on her face were making shiny lines on her skin. He felt that she was older and wiser than he was. Okay, she said, but I'm not doing it for Mrs. Solomon or your dad. I'm doing it for you. Thanks. Despite what she'd just said, he felt lonely and lost. When he left her, she wanted to go to Croxley Street alone. He walked slowly through the rain. He felt the damp seep onto his shoulders, trickled ran down his neck, and the rain soaked his shoes and the legs of his trousers. From out of nowhere, he found himself hoping that he would catch pneumonia and die. He saw himself lying in a bed, surrounded by all the people he knew. They were crying and saying how sorry they were that they'd been horrible to him, but it was too late. The following morning, Charmian was waiting for him outside the school gate. I saw Mrs. Solomon. She said she'd do it. Great. I told you she'd be pleased. Maybe, but I'm still scared. There was nothing he could say, because he was scared too. Chapter 18. Lots of times in the next couple of days, Buddy felt like calling the whole thing off. He went over and over the plan in his head, over and over the plan, until his head felt as if it were burning. He noticed that his hands had started to shake, and he often found his foot tapping madly on its own. What's the matter with you? You're like a cat on hot bricks, his dad said on Thursday evening. Buddy said it was nothing and tried harder not to let his nervousness show. If his dad knew what he was planning, he'd go crazy. Supposing he found out afterwards? The thought sent his brain spinning. Yet again, he went through the plan. Was there any way that someone could find out? Mrs. Solomon would call the police to say that someone was breaking into 56. When they arrived and found Mr. King with a lot of stolen things, he would think that it had all been caused by the nosiness of a neighbour. No one could possibly link it to Buddy. As for his dad, he would just think it was a stroke of luck that Buddy had got his mum to come round at that particular time. No, it was perfect. He must stop worrying. It was easier said than done, of course, and that night he lay awake for hours. The sky was growing light when he finally fell asleep, and he couldn't have been asleep for more than a couple of hours before the alarm clock woke him. Yet strangely, he felt great. All his doubts and fears of the night were gone. He was certain that he was doing the right thing and that it would all go well. Just before he left for school, his dad came down and asked him to change his bandages again. The cuts were healing well and he could move all his fingers, but his face was still pale and worn from the pain and the worry. Well, after tonight, all the worrying would be over. But he wanted to say something, to tell him it would be all right. But he went on tying the bandages and lowered his head to hide the hope and pleasure that was making him smile madly. During the day, he found himself ticking off the hours like the countdown to the launching of a spaceship. 7:15 was 0 hour. At lunchtime he saw Charmian and went over everything again. He'd said that 7:30 would be early enough for her to arrive at Mrs. Solomon's, but she said she'd be there at 7, just to make sure. Then they went together to find Julius. Charmian said it would be better to tell him the truth, but Buddy had refused, so they had to give him an alibi about where they were going to be. Jules, Charmian said when they found him, we want you to keep a secret. Yeah? What? Promise you won't say? Okay, what is it? I'm not going to the satellite tonight, but you mustn't tell Mum. Where are you going? She's coming out with me, Buddy said. Julius burst out laughing. You dirty old man! Buddy blushed and he saw Charmian lower her eyes. Julius was going to tease them forever about this, but it had to be done. Julius giggled and made all kinds of jokes, but he agreed not to tell his parents that Charmian hadn't been at the club. The afternoon lessons seemed endless, but the hours at home were worse. Whenever he looked at his watch, he couldn't believe how slowly the minutes were passing. He stayed in his room because he didn't want his dad to see how tense he was, but he felt like a wild animal trapped in a cage. He stared out of the window without really seeing anything until nearly 6 o'clock, then went down to make the tea. He was just cutting the bread for some sandwiches when a terrible thought struck him. The knife slipped and sliced into his finger next to the nail. There was a stab of pain, but he took no notice of it. Mrs. Solomon's phone number. He didn't know her phone number. He rushed out the kitchen door and ran along the old path, ducking low so his dad wouldn't see him through the window. He planned everything so carefully. On Wednesday evening, he'd even made the journey to his house to 56 Croxley Street in order to take how long it took. Yet now, at the last moment, there were still essential things he hadn't done. He ran down the road to the telephone box, hoping desperately that her number would be in the directory. If it wasn't, what could he do? It would throw out all the timing. If he couldn't ring Charmian there, someone was in the phone box. He stood outside and noticed the blood dripping from his finger. He sucked it, then pulled off the flap of loose skin. It wasn't a bad cut, but the blood kept swelling after it, so he wrapped his paper handkerchief round it. They were still talking on the phone. But he looked at his watch. Nearly 6:15. Only an hour to go. Hurry up! At last the man put down the phone and pushed the door open. But he dived in and grabbed the directory. Just in case anybody's not aware, the directory in this case is a telephone directory, otherwise known as a phone book. Buddy dived in and grabbed the directory. He flicked the pages P, Q, R, S, S, E, S, K, S, N, and then finally S, O. Solid, Solly, and then Solomon. He went down the list with his finger, and there it was. Solomon, Mrs. L.E. 54 Foxley Street, 218179. He repeated the number until he was sure he knew it, and then chanted it to himself all the way home. He dashed upstairs, tore a bit of paper from the back of an exercise book and scribbled the number. It looked strange written down. Had he got it right? Panic began to rise in him, but he fought it down. Of course it was right. He sat on the bed, breathing deeply and pressing his finger until it hurt. Blood started to soak through the white paper, and it throbbed horribly, but it stopped his crazy thoughts. He must stay calm. Buddy, I thought you were going to make the tea. His dad came called from downstairs. Sorry, just coming. His finger made it awkward to cut the bread, but he made a couple of rather thick cheese sandwiches. He took them with a cup of tea into the front room and gave them to his dad. Where's yours? His dad asked. I've eaten them, Buddy lied. The very thought of food made him feel sick. Looks as if you've been eating your finger too. Oh, I just cut it. I'll go and put something on it, Buddy said, glad of an excuse to get away. He went to the bathroom, washed his finger, and wrapped a plaster around it, then sat on the edge of the bath, gazing at the numbers ticking away on his watch. At exactly 7:10, he stood up and walked slowly and deliberately downstairs. I'm going down the satellite, he said from the doorway of the front room. Okay, see you later. I'll probably be back before you. Buddy nodded, opened the front door, and left the house. This was it. He waited at the end of the road. His face was hot and his heart was beating fast, but he wouldn't let himself look at his watch. There was nothing to worry about. There was plenty of time, and his mum had promised she wouldn't be late. Even so, he kept peering back in the direction of the house to make sure there was no sign of his dad leaving yet. When a bus appeared in the distance, he allowed himself a quick peek at the time. 7:25. She had to be on this one, unless of course she decided to walk. The bus drew up at the stop. Somebody had got off, but he couldn't see who because the bus was in the way. The driver accelerated and the bus pulled away. It was his mum. She was wearing a shiny black raincoat and her face looked white and serious. Halfway across the main road, she saw him and nodded. A car was coming fast and she waited until it passed, then strolled towards him with her hands in her pockets. Well, here I am, she said. Don't ask me why. You look nice. I suppose that's something. Her voice was flat and she barely looked at him. They walked slowly along the pavement. He felt that she was hanging back, not wanting to get there. He stopped 3 houses away from his house. Aren't you coming? She asked, surprised. I thought it would be better if you... He couldn't finish the sentence, and he looked at her helplessly. Great, she said bitterly, then strode off towards the house. She rang the bell, and Buddy pressed himself flat against the wall. When he peeped out, the door was open, casting a shaft of light on his mum, but he couldn't see his dad. His mum was talking. She smiled, then stepped inside. As the door closed, Buddy ran past before they could get into the front room. His dad mustn't see him. He glanced quickly at the window, but kept running. She'd been smiling when she went in. That must be a good sign. She'd just been nervous. That was why she'd snapped it in. It would be all right now. He got to the telephone box. It was empty. He picked up the phone, checked the number on the piece of paper, and dialed. Fancy panicking about Mrs. Solomon's number. He could easily have looked it up now instead of earlier. That just showed how he worried unnecessarily. Everything was going perfectly. At this very minute, his mum and dad were together again after all this time, and he was the one who'd done it. The pips went, and he put the coin in. Buddy? Charmian's voice was breathless and excited. Yes, it's okay. My mum's there. I'm on my way. He's here, Buddy. Mr. King. He got here about 7:15. I watched him from the window. He's early. That's all right. Shall I get Mrs. Solomon to ring now? Buddy looked at his watch. 7:41. Why not? If he was there already, it didn't matter what time they rang. On the other hand, it might be best to stick to the plan. No, wait until 8. Oh, Buddy, please. I want to get it over with. She sounded a bit panicky. If he ran most of the way, he could be there in about a quarter of an hour. How long would the police take once they got the phone call? 10 minutes? At least that. He could afford to let her ring a bit earlier. Okay, you can ring at 7:50, but not before. I'll be there as soon as I can. He slammed the phone down and started to run. The back streets were deserted, but each time he came to a main road there was still a lot of traffic, and he had to wait before he could cross. The cold air hurt, but he ran till his legs began to give out, then slowed down to the fast walk. He passed the cinema where he'd first told the twins about the house all those weeks ago, and a couple of minutes later he was in Malham Road. 7:53. Mrs. Solomon must have rung by now. Perhaps the police were already on their way. The thought drove him on, and he started running again. He could see the main road ahead. Over that, past the Germain Arms, and he would be in Croxley Street. A few more minutes. He reached the main road and stood panting, waiting for a gap in the traffic. He looked across to the Germain Arms. A man emerged from the darkness of Croxley Street on the brightly lit forecourt of the pub. There was a break in the traffic, and Buddy was halfway across the road before he realized the man was Mr. King. He stopped in horror and watched Mr. King walk to the door and go into the pub. A car horn honked, and Buddy ran the rest of the way to the pavement, just in time. Someone yelled at him from the car, but he didn't care. He raced up to the pub door and pushed it open slightly. Mr. King was standing at the bar, talking to the barman. Buddy prayed that he was only buying something like cigarettes, but his heart sank as he saw the barman draw a pint of beer and put it on the counter. Mr. King paid, picked up the glass, and walked over to a table. He took off his overcoat and sat down. This was no quick drink. He was staying there. Buddy let go of the door and dashed away. Down Croxley Street. Chapter 19. What had gone wrong? Supposing the police came now, the house would be empty. Charmian seen Mr. King leave? Would she ring the police again and say there'd been a mistake? His lungs were on fire, and he could hear each rasping breath he took. His heart was pounding, and the streetlights danced and jumped in front of him as a car drove past. Was it the police? His eyes were full of tears and he couldn't see properly. He brushed his hand across them and blinked. Now the car was too far away, but it didn't seem to be slowing. No, it was disappearing into the distance, and he was nearly there. He staggered past number 56 and pulled open the gate to Mrs. Solomon's house. He misjudged the step to the front door and went sprawling, banging his knee. He pulled himself to his feet and limped the rest of the way up the flight of steps. As he reached the porch, the front door opened and Charmian was there. In the hall behind her, Buddy glimpsed Mrs. Solomon sitting in her wheelchair. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "He's gone!" Charmian shouted, and her eyes were wide with worry. Mrs. Solomon had just put the phone down. I went into the room. She saw him. She rang when you said, "What are we going to do?" But he shook his head and felt his stomach heave. He leaned over the edge of the stairway, but although a bitter taste from the back of his throat, he couldn't be sick. "Ring," he croaked. "Gotta ring them. Nobody, we can't. Just let them come. Mrs. Solomon didn't say who she was or anything. They won't know it was us. He'll get away. We can't help it. Come in and I'll get you a drink." Charmian headed for the kitchen, and Buddy leaned against the doorframe and slid down into a crouch, his face almost between his knees. When he raised his head again, he saw Mrs. Solomon. She hadn't moved. She looked at him and started stroking the cats on her lap, smiling as if the whole thing was a good joke. Charmian came back with a glass of water. He took a couple of sips to clear his throat, then drank half of it in one go. He felt it gurgle and slosh down to his stomach. Then he drank the rest, a gulp at a time, cooling the rawness in his throat. "Come in and let me close the door," Charmian said. He shook his head. He didn't want to stay here in this mad woman's house. Far away, he heard a roar. The police, probably. He forced himself up and handed the glass to Charmian. "I'm going," he said. The roar was getting louder. Charmian had noticed it now. She moved her head slightly to hear it better. "It's them. They're coming," she said, pulling at his arms and beginning to close the door. But he shrugged himself free. If he was quick, he could be in the shadows on the other side of the road before they arrived. He heard Charmian shout as he dodged out of the closing door. The door had slammed behind him, but that wasn't what he was listening to. That roar didn't come from a car. It was a motorbike. Had they sent a motorbike cop? He came along the path to a garden gate. The bike was nearly there. No time to get across the road now. He saw the dazzling headlight, heard the engine rev, and the driver changed down. The headlight beam swept towards the pavement. The engine roared, then cut out as the bike glided to a stop. The light went out. Buddy peered round the gatepost. It was his dad. He was wearing his helmet, but Buddy knew him by the bandages on his hands. He swung off the bike, rocked it back onto its stand, and pulled his chin strap. He took the helmet off and rested it on the seat, then began feeling his hands and flexing the fingers as if they were stiff and painful. Buddy stepped out onto the pavement. Dad glanced up, and even in the dim light, the shock shone on his face. "What the hell are you doing here?" Why aren't you his mum? Buddy's voice was hoarse and he cleared his throat. You had no right to do that, Buddy. What happened? What happened? What do you think happened? Did she go? Of course she went. You had no right. Buddy saw it all. Saw them standing awkwardly in the front room. They probably hadn't even got as far as the front room. It was his fault, but he hated them, both of them. He might have guessed that his dad would freeze up and not say anything. He always did. And his mum, she could be so sarcastic when she wanted to. He remembered the way his heart had shriveled when she'd said, great, and just walked away. In a mood like that, she was bound to have said something horrible, and the row would have started. Just like before. Just like always. He hated them. They would never get back together. I told the police, he said suddenly, and then repeated it slowly, wanting every word to hurt his dad as much as possible. His dad looked at him, puzzled, then his eyes grew wide as it sank in. He glanced over Buddy's shoulder. Then he turned slowly and looked back along the road in the other direction. When? He said. Buddy had expected anger, even to be hit, but the slow movements and the gentleness of his dad's voice threw him. 10 minutes ago. His dad turned back and looked directly at him. He made you do it, Buddy said. I wanted the cops to get him so you could stop. His dad spun round and dashed towards the gate of 56. Buddy ran after him and grabbed his arm. He's not there. He's gone. I saw him go into the pub. Des King. Des King? Buddy nodded. What about Ralph? Ralph? Was there someone else? Charlie hadn't said anything about anyone else. Then it hit him. Ralph James Campbell. The Beast. In Buddy's plan, the Beast had hardly counted as a real person at all. He hadn't actually wanted to get him into trouble like Mr. King, but he hadn't seemed important enough to worry about. One look at his dad's face changed that. To him, the Beast was a man called Ralph. A man who mattered. Was Ralph with Des? His dad shouted, and he grabbed hold of him and shook him. Buddy was glad. He wanted his dad to shake him until he fell to pieces, but his bandaged hands were still weak, and they slipped off Buddy's arms. Was he? His dad shouted. No. His dad ran towards the house, then turned and yelled, Go! Now! Get away! When his dad disappeared down the side alley towards the back of the house, Buddy ran to the gateway of number 54. As he opened the gate, he caught a flash of blue light out of the corner of his eye. Then the light came again, sending a blue flicker across the branches of the trees. Then Buddy saw the car further along the road. It was moving slowly as if the occupants were checking the houses to find the right one. No siren. That would give the alarm. The blue light flashed round and round, almost hypnotizing him until, at the last moment, he drew back behind the hedge. There was a soft scrunch from the tyres as the car came nearer. The light stabbed through the hedge, and he crouched down and closed his eyes. He stood there, holding his breath and straining to hear something. Nothing. Total silence. Had it gone past? He opened his eyes. There was no blue light. Perhaps they'd missed the house. There might be time to dash and give the warning before they came back. He stood up, stepped out the gate, and froze. The car was there, parked outside number 56. All the lights were off. They must be waiting before going in. Mad ideas filled his head. He could run past and pretend he was the one who'd broken into the house. Or he could go up there and say that he'd seen some people run out of the house 5 minutes ago. Or he could pretend he was ill and had to go to the hospital. Anything to give his dad time to get away. He walked quickly to the car and bent down to open the door. It was empty. He heard nothing. No engine noise, no opening and closing of doors. It was as if it was a ghost car, and as silently as ghosts, the police had left the car and gone into the house. It was too late. There was nothing he could do. He ran to the other side of the road and hid himself in the deep shadows under a low-hanging tree. The blood was pulsing round his body, filling his ears with its throb. 2 cars passed, the drivers automatically slowing to look at the police car. Time ticked by with the beating of his blood, and he began to count. 1, 2. When he reached 135, he saw Mr. King walking through the pool of light under a lamppost a long way down the road. He watched him walk steadily out of the light into darkness, then into the light of a nearer lamppost. He was whistling. When he saw the police car, he stopped as suddenly as if he walked into an invisible wall. He stood for a moment and then took a couple of steps backwards before turning, and walking quickly away. Buddy watched him until he disappeared in the far darkness. He started to count again. He reached 500 and went back to the beginning. It was taking a long time. Perhaps his dad had got out in time and run away across the back gardens. Perhaps he was still in the house, talking to the police, convincing them that he had every right to be there, that the phone call had been a false alarm. The thoughts muddled up his counting. Better not to think. Better just to count his heartbeats. He started again. He reached 500 twice more and then had to stop because the pounding of his blood had faded until he could no longer count his heartbeats. He looked at his watch. 8:35. How long had they been inside? The front door of number 54 opened, and Charmian was framed in the light from the hall. She made large, beckoning signs with her arm. Could she see him here in the shadows, or had she been watching every movement since the whole thing began? He didn't move. She started to signal again, then looked sideways at number 56 and ducked back inside the door. A moment later, a policeman stepped out of the gateway. He was stepped out from the gateway. He was carrying the briefcase that had the jewelry in it. He got into the front of the car, leaving the door open. Buddy saw him speak and heard the tinny reply of the radio. Then his dad came out of the gate, followed by the beast and another policeman. His dad went straight to the car, opened the back door, and got in. He slid along the seat to allow the beast in. The policeman closed the door behind them, then walked to the car and got into the front seat. The driver was still talking into the microphone, and his door was open so the inside light was on. But he could see his dad clearly. He lay back against the seat and closed his eyes. Then the beast leaned forward and put his head in his hands as if he were crying. His dad sat up and put his arm round the beast's shoulders. The front door slammed. The light went off. The engine purred into life as silently as it had arrived, and the car drove away. And as silently as it had arrived, the car drove away. The whole thing had been so calm. His dad and the beast hadn't been held or pushed. They'd got into the car as if it had been a taxi. The policeman had closed the door politely behind them. It looked as if they'd been going to a funeral. That's why the beast had cried. Someone must be dead. His dad's bike was still there. Buddy walked across the room and pulled it off his stand. He had to leave it somewhere safe. He humped it up onto the pavement, wheeled it into Mrs. Solomon's garden, and parked it on her lawn. He took out the keys and slipped them into his pocket. His dad could pick it up when they came back from the funeral. Buddy stood and stayed by the bike, staring at it. There was nowhere to go. Miss Solomon's front door closed, and he held his footsteps. Charmian took hold of his arm. "You better come with me, Buddy." She pulled, and he let himself be led away. Oh dear, so Buddy had a plan to help his dad, but it's all gone a bit wrong, hasn't it? Poor old Buddy. Let's hope things get better for them, eh? What do you reckon, Layla? Will things get better for Buddy and his dad? What do you think? Yeah? I hope so too. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a bit of a marathon reading today. Thank you so much for watching, subscribing, commenting. It really, really makes my day when you do. And hopefully, little Layla and I will see you again soon. Cheerio!